The Silk Road. In Chinese, it's called Sichou Zhilu. It was a trade route stretching from China all the way to Europe and North Africa, bringing Chinese silks, teas, paper, and even gunpowder to the West. And horses, gold, and products like glassware, as well as new philosophies to China. And yes, it is the Silk Road that gave the name to the dark web marketplace where you could buy all sorts of highly illegal items. That was later shut down by the FBI in 2013, but then it popped up again and was then shut down again in 2015. But actually, the real Silk Road from China to Europe through the Middle East, although undoubtedly home to some black market dealings, was largely a positive route, allowing products, inventions, culture, and religion to flow across the world. For example, the earliest known paper in the world comes from China and was spread to the West along the Silk Road. And Buddhism, originally from India, spread the other way to China through the Silk Road system. There were Buddha statues all along the Silk Road, like these two in the Bamiyan Valley in what is modern-day Afghanistan. Unfortunately, these two statues were destroyed by the Taliban in 2001, but they had stood watching over the route for around 1,500 years. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, the real-life inspiration for the Tang monk in Journey to the West, walked past these very statues when he made his pilgrimage to India to obtain the Buddhist scriptures during the Tang dynasty. But how did it all start? How did China, whose geography actually isolated it from the rest of the world, open up this route and allow products, culture, and wisdom to flow back and forth? In this video, you're going to find out. This is the origin of China's trade route that changed the world. Trade has been going back and forth between China and the Middle East and Europe for thousands of years. Remnants of Chinese silk dating back to 1,070 years BC have been found in Egypt, and some archaeological evidence points to even earlier. But it seems this early trade was on a smaller scale and not something that had the support of the Chinese emperor. That all changed around 130 BC. Thanks to Emperor Han Wudi of the Han Dynasty. You see, at that time, the map of China looked something like this. You had the Han Dynasty ruling the Central Plains, some of the northeast, and some of the south, with its capital at Chang'an. You then had the confederation of nomadic tribes known as Xiongnu to the north, and the Qiang, who were ancestors of the Tibetan people and had been subjugated by the Xiongnu to the southwest. The Xiongnu caused big problems for the Han Dynasty. Due to China's geography, the north was the only place invaders could really come from. But come they did. In 166 BC, around 140,000 horsemen marched into China from the north on a raiding mission, reaching only about 100 miles from the capital before they returned home. China had originally been trying to subdue the Xiongnu with gifts of silk, rice, and even marrying off Han princesses to the tribal chiefs in a practice called Heqin that was supposed to ensure peace. However, all these gifts seemed to only embolden the Xiongnu, and in 139 BC, Han Wudi changed his tactics. He knew he needed to fight off the Xiongnu instead of appease them, so he sent a man named Zhang Qian to the west, through the only natural break in the mountains called the Hexi Corridor, to try and form an alliance with the Yuezhi, a nomadic people who had previously lived in the Hexi Corridor area, and fight the Xiongnu together. But Zhang Qian's route took him through Xiongnu-controlled territory, and he was captured by the Xiongnu on the way and held prisoner for over a decade. However, that isn't the end of his story. We'll get back to him in a moment. In the year 133 BC, with still no word from Zhang Qian, Han Wudi started sending out expeditions of up to 300,000 men and basically conquered the whole of the Hexi Corridor, which is modern-day Gansu province. That's why it is that weird shape, because it follows the only route through the mountains. He then dispatched over 1 million people to colonize the area and set up 4 military garrisons in the region, cutting the Xiongnu off from the Qiang to the southwest. The Han now controlled the route out of China into Central Asia. But this was very expensive, and the Han lost a great number of men and horses in these campaigns. Now, back to Zhang Qian. While in Xiongnu captivity, he actually married a Xiongnu wife and had a son. So it doesn't really sound that bad, okay? It's not like he was being held in some dungeon or anything. But after 10 years, he eventually did escape, and he continued his journey, traveling through an area known as Wusun Guo, and then arriving at a place called Dayuan in Chinese, or Fergana, on the far western side of the Tarim Basin. These people were descendants of Greeks and had a pretty advanced civilization. Here's an account of Dayuan from the records of the Grand Historian, or Shiji. Dayuan is to the southwest of Xiongnu territory and directly west of the Han, 10,000 li from China. The people there have settled the land and are farming, growing rice and wheat. They had wine made from grapes and a lot of good horses that sweated blood. These were heavenly horses. They had walled cities with houses and buildings, over 70 cities, large and small, with over 100,000 people. Their soldiers used bows and spears and could shoot while riding horses. Now, these so-called heavenly horses sweating blood sound kind of scary, but it's thought that they had been bitten by some parasite that caused blood to mix into their sweat. But despite this fact, it seems that Zhang Qian was really impressed with these horses, and it was just what the Han Dynasty needed. However, the kingdom of Dayuan refused to sell any of their fine steeds to the Han. He wrapped up his trip with a visit to the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and a visit to the Yuezhi nomadic people, the original purpose of the trip. But they didn't want to help fight the Xiongnu, so he kind of went home empty-handed. And on top of that, he was then captured by the Xiongnu again on the way home and held captive for 2 more years until the Xiongnu leader died and he escaped, making it back to China in 126 BC, with nothing but the intelligence he had gathered that there were advanced civilizations out west beyond the frontier that had walled cities, farmed on a large scale, used coins as money, and were already buying Chinese goods such as silk, and they also bred fine horses. Now, this piqued Emperor Wu Di's interest. He had lost a lot of horses in their campaign to secure the Hexi corridor, and this was just what he needed to defeat the Xiongnu. The records of the Grand Historian record the emperor saying, "The divine horses come from the northwest. It would be good to get these Wu Sun horses, which are called heavenly horses, or even get the blood-sweating horses of Dayuan. They are strong and robust. From further west of Wu Sun, the horses of Dayuan are heavenly horses." Thus, Emperor Wu Di sent out Zhang Qian again to try and buy heavenly horses, but the king of Dayuan would not sell, and he even stole the gold that Zhang Qian had brought him. This then led to the War of Heavenly Horses, or Tianma Zhizhan, where a general named Li Guangli was sent out to take horses by force. At first he failed, but then he came back with a larger force, and by 101 BC, Dayuan had fallen and the Han installed a pro-Han government in Dayuan. Seeing this projection of power, many small states in the region switched their alliance from the Xiongnu to the Han, and thus the Han Dynasty acquired what is referred to as the Western Protectorate, which is basically all of modern-day Xinjiang province. The Han army brought back large numbers of fine horses, which they used in campaigns against the Xiongnu, and the Han started to win. By 55 BC, the Xiongnu broke up into 5 groups fighting amongst themselves, and the Han cut a deal with the southern Xiongnu for them to be a tribute state, and they kept the other Xiongnu tribes further north at bay. The Han did send large quantities of silk to the southern Xiongnu, and this silk was traded all through Central Asia by various middlemen, making its way as far as the Roman Empire, where it was very popular during the time of Julius Caesar. In return, gold, horses, and items like furs and glassware were coming back the other way into China. By now, the Silk Road system, which comprised several different routes, was thoroughly developed, and it was the Silk Road that enabled Buddhism to spread from India into China, with famous Buddhist sites all along the route, like the Buddha statues we talked about in Afghanistan, but also the famous Qianfo Dong, or 1,000 Buddha caves at Dunhuang in China, just before you pass through the Hexi corridor into China proper, where you can see multiple cave paintings and Buddha statues. Now, there were 3 distinct high points in trade activity on the Silk Road. The first was in the Han Dynasty. The second was in the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907 AD, and the third was during the Yuan Dynasty from 1271 to 1368 AD, where the whole of China was under Mongol rule, and for at least some of this time, the Mongol Empire encompassed pretty much the entire Silk Road throughout Central Asia. But it wasn't a road that any one person would typically travel the whole way down. Items would be traded by merchants who traveled their own sections of the road and would pass through many hands before making it to the other end. But there was one man who did travel the entire route, and that was Marco Polo. The Italian explorer Marco Polo traveled all the way down the Silk Road from Europe to China between the years of 1271 and 1295. And he actually met the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan, who gave him a job as a diplomat, and he traveled to many neighboring kingdoms such as India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, as well as extensively inside of China. He spent 17 years there, and when he came back, he wrote his book, The Travels of Marco Polo, that gave a detailed account of the whole adventure. He is probably the most famous explorer to visit China during such an early period in history, and much of the West's early knowledge of China comes from his book. After the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the Silk Road started to decline, and European powers started taking advantage of sea routes to trade with China. By this time, the production methods of silk, which the Chinese had invented and originally tried to keep secret, had spread to many other countries, and it was even being produced in Europe. After silk, the next Chinese product that the West would get obsessed with was tea, and this was transported by ship. But that's a story for another time. The Silk Road goes down in history as probably the greatest trade corridor the world has ever known, that facilitated an exchange of goods, philosophy, and ideas, and through the writings of Marco Polo, shared the magic of China with the West. And if you want to see the magic of China on stage, you have to check out Shenyun Performing Arts, the world's premier Chinese performing arts company, delivering myths and legends from Chinese history. They are still on their world tour that finishes in just a few weeks, so depending on where you are in the world, you may still have a chance to catch this season's show. Click the link down below to watch the trailer, and if you do go on to buy a ticket, use our code LCN2025 for a waived booking fee on all US show dates. Alright guys, that is the video for today. Please subscribe if you're new, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.